Listen carefully. Because in the next 8 seconds, you're going to hear something a woman in 1847 was never meant to say, something so forbidden that the world around her tried to collapse the moment it left her lips. Picture a flickering lamp in a cramped Boston boarding room, a Virginia lawyer's shadow stretching across the floor, and a former slave, heart pounding, realizing that for the first time in her life, she could refuse a white man's command. One word. One impossible word. No. And the moment she said it, she stepped into a kind of freedom so terrifying it almost swallowed her whole. You and I right now, we're going to walk into the world behind that moment. Not the polite version in textbooks. The real version. The version built on forged papers, secret alliances, corruption wrapped in virtue, and a northern city pretending to be righteous while quietly laundering southern power through its banks, courts, and pulpits. Boston liked to call itself the Athens of America. What it really was a stage where every man and woman played a role assigned by forces older and colder than law. Margaret, though her true name was Sarah, had spent 23 years learning the choreography of obedience. Every instinct she had was sculpted by a system designed to break the will before it ever formed. On the Hartwick plantation, obedience wasn't taught, it was engineered. Contradiction was punished. Hesitation was punished. Even thought was punished if it wandered too far into the territory of selfhood. You don't choose a personality in a place like that. You inherit the one fear builds for you. So when Sarah escaped through crawl spaces, false floors, Quaker kitchens, and a fishing boat's dark hold, she arrived in Boston with the body of a survivor, but the reflexes of the enslaved. The city towered over her like a god made of brick and coal. People moved in waves that didn't acknowledge her existence. That anonymity felt like freedom, but also like exposure. Because freedom without power is only a louder kind of danger. And lurking beneath Boston's respectable surface was an unspoken truth you won't find in school books. The North didn't hate the South system, it envied its efficiency. Its ability to control bodies, control labor, control minds. Here, instead of chains, they used paperwork. Instead of overseers, they used clerks. Instead of whips, silence. And into that silence, Margaret carried a forged identity. Margaret Thornhill, her entire freedom held inside a single folded document hanging from her neck like a borrowed soul. She didn't know it yet, but someone powerful was hunting that document. Hunting her. And hunting the network that dared to rewrite fate itself. Before we go further, you need to understand something most people never grasp. Escaping a system doesn't mean it stops controlling you. Sometimes the chains stay inside your mind long after your hands are free. And Margaret, still new to her stolen name, was walking through Boston with shackles only she could feel. Chains built from reflex, fear, and the memory of men who believed they owned her breath. But Boston had its own masters, its own invisible overseers, and its own hunger for obedience. In the winter of 1846, when Margaret earned her forged papers, she thought she was buying protection. What she was really buying was entry into a world where freedom could be revoked with a whisper. The document didn't say, "You are free." It said, "You are tolerated, for now." And every abolitionist who touched those papers knew it. Mrs. Fletcher, Reverend Hayes, Solomon, Ruth, Daniel, and Esther. They were freedom workers, yes, but they were also operating inside a shadow economy that Boston's higher classes pretended not to see, even while benefiting from the very system they condemned. That's the truth polite history hides. Boston was addicted to Southern cotton. Its wealth ran through merchant ledgers that might as well have been written in blood. And men who profit from chains rarely punish the people who forge them. So when whispers began, rumors of an outsider asking questions, combing signatures, tracing clerks, they didn't just signal danger. They signaled strategy. Someone wasn't hunting individuals. Someone was hunting infrastructure. Someone wanted to tear down the entire system that shielded people like Margaret and replace it with fear. On a late May night, in the dim parlor of Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house, that truth came slithering into the open. The curtains were drawn. Candles burned low. Every breath felt overheard. Mrs. Fletcher's voice trembled as she explained what she'd learned. A man from Virginia was in Boston. A lawyer. Soft-spoken. Patient. Too patient. His name was Edward Crane. And if you know anything about the psychology of power, you know the most dangerous men don't break down doors. They build cases. He wasn't grabbing fugitives on street corners. He wasn't shouting accusations. He was mapping the entire network, its forgers, its safe houses, its clerks, its runners, and he was doing it with a cold precision that sent a ripple of terror through the room. Solomon's hands clenched. Ruth stared at the floor. Reverend Hayes went still, calculating. And Margaret reached for the pouch around her neck, feeling her entire identity tremble like a candle flame. Because if Edward Crane exposed the forgeries, if he discredited the signatures, then Margaret wouldn't just lose her protection. She would lose her name, her freedom, her future. She would become Sarah again. And the North would send her back. Quietly, legally, efficiently, as if she were a ledger error being corrected. This was the moment the descent began. This was the moment Margaret realized. Freedom was not a place. It was a battlefield. The night after Mrs. Fletcher revealed Crane's presence, Margaret barely slept. She lay in her narrow attic room with the city's coal-choked wind rattling the window panes, clutching her papers against her chest as if she could keep her identity from evaporating through sheer force of will. But freedom built on a forgery is a fragile thing, and Margaret knew that men like Crane delighted in shattering fragile things. You need to understand the psychology of someone like him. The South didn't just send slave catchers north. They sent men who studied human weakness like scripture. Men trained to read hesitation, fear, guilt, men who could dismantle resistance without raising their voice. Edward Crane wasn't here for the thrill of the hunt. He was here for a thesis. Prove that even in the so-called free North, no black person was safe without South's permission. A political victory disguised as legal work. And Margaret, quiet, small, unassuming, was the perfect target. She didn't know it yet, but Crane had already traced several forged documents back to Beacon Hill. He'd tracked alterations in ink color, inconsistencies in clerk handwriting, mismatched registry stamps. He was closing in like a frost that begins at the edges of a window and creeps inward. By early June, he had a name: Thornhill. A woman recently arrived, recently documented, recently visible. So he went looking. Meanwhile, inside the boarding house, tension thickened like smoke. Reverend Hayes urged everyone to stay inside after dark. Solomon altered his route to the docks each morning, wary of unfamiliar footsteps behind him. Ruth slept with her shoes on, and Margaret, she stitched garments with trembling fingers, afraid the door would open at any moment. But here's the discomforting truth you must face. Fear alone does not break a person. What breaks them is the realization that their survival depends on a system that was never designed for them to survive. Margaret sensed this. She felt it in every sideways glance from Boston elites who smiled at abolitionist speeches but invested in textile mills fed by Southern plantations. She felt it in the silence of the courts. She felt it in the wealth that glittered on Beacon Hill like a polite mask stretched over centuries of exploitation. And still she worked. She obeyed the rituals of freedom the way she once obeyed the rituals of enslavement, quietly, carefully, invisibly. She believed obedience would keep her safe. But power isn't appeased by obedience. Power feeds on it. The truth is, Margaret wasn't hidden. She was being circled. And on September 14th, 1847, her past finally found her door. On the evening of September 14th, 1847, everything Margaret feared materialized in the sound of a knock too firm to be polite, too calm to be desperate. A predator's knock. A man who already believed the door would open. And when Mrs. Fletcher ushered the visitor into the sitting room, the air shifted. Even before he spoke, Margaret felt it. That cold, analytical presence she had known all her life, the presence of someone who thinks your existence is a matter of paperwork. Edward Crane. He didn't arrive in rage. He didn't arrive with shackles. He arrived with a notebook, a quill, and a soft, almost sympathetic voice. The voice of a man who has learned that kindness is the sharpest blade. He introduced himself as an attorney from Richmond. He complimented the boarding house. He smiled at Mrs. Fletcher like a gentleman visiting old friends. But his eyes never left Margaret. She sat perfectly still, spine rigid, hands clasped in her lap to keep them from shaking. She could feel her old training kick in. Make yourself small, agreeable, invisible. But visibility was exactly what Crane came for. He already had the dates, the names, the registry copies. What he wanted now was confirmation, the human signature to match the forged one. "May I see your papers?" he asked, voice soft as silk. He asked it the way a man asks for a coat, as if the request were natural, harmless, expected. And this is where you must understand the deeper layer. Crane didn't need the papers. He already suspected they were forged. What he wanted was to watch her obedience, to see if her mind still bent the way an enslaved woman's mind was supposed to bend. The South trained men like him to assess psychology as much as legality. Mrs. Fletcher stepped forward, but Crane raised a hand, gentle, polite, controlling. "I'm speaking to her." For Margaret, the room collapsed into a single point of terror. 23 years of conditioning surged upward like a tidal wave. Obey, obey, obey. Her breath tightened. Her vision narrowed. She reached instinctively for the pouch around her neck. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the long months of watching Boston's abolitionists risk their lives. Maybe it was the memory of Peter. Maybe it was the exhaustion of living as a guest in her own freedom. Or maybe it was that strange moment, a spark, when she realized that this was not Virginia. This man did not own her body. This man did not own her fate. And for the first time, obedience felt like a lie. Crane leaned closer. "Show me your papers." Margaret lifted her eyes, met his, and with a voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of every beating she'd survived, she spoke a word she had never spoken to a white man in her life. "No." The room froze. Crane's smile vanished. Mrs. Fletcher inhaled sharply. Silence hung like a loaded gun. And in that silence, Margaret became something she had never been before. Dangerous. The moment that word left her lips, Crane's expression didn't change, at least not in a way most people would notice. But Margaret noticed. Men like him were trained to hide their reactions. Yet for a split second, something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, not surprise, but calculation. The way a man recalculates the weight of a threat he underestimated. Because that's what she became the instant she refused him. Not a runaway, not a fugitive, not a forged name on a fragile document, but a variable he could no longer control. He leaned back slightly, folding his hands. "Why not?" he asked. Not shouted, not hissed. Asked quiet, sharp, surgical. Margaret's throat tightened. Old instincts clawed upward. Apologize, explain, correct yourself. But something inside her had shifted. Something small and long buried a part of her that had once belonged entirely to the Hartwicks, now bracing itself like a blade finally finding its edge. Mrs. Fletcher moved protectively to Margaret's side, sensing danger thickening in the room. Crane turned his attention to her with a smooth, predatory politeness. "Interfering with federal law, ma'am, is a serious offense. You wouldn't want to obstruct an inquiry." It was a threat wrapped in a compliment. Reverend Hayes entered the room then, drawn by the voices. Crane greeted him with the same civil venom. "Reverend Hayes, I trust a man of God respects the law." Hayes smiled faintly. "God's law, yes." That answer in any other setting would have been a sermon. Here it was a declaration of war. You see, men like Crane don't attack directly. They tighten the air slowly, make everyone around them suffocate on possibilities. Arrest, exposure, humiliation. A court that will not believe you. A jury that will not protect you. A nation waiting to remind you of your place. And Margaret felt all of it pressing against her ribs. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, feel the weight of every life depending on her silence, her compliance, her obedience. Crane softened his voice, turning back to her with dangerous gentleness. "You understand what's at stake. Just show me the papers." The demand slid into the room like a poisoned whisper. But here's the deeper truth. Crane wasn't just testing her forged identity. He was testing whether the slave inside her was still alive. She swallowed. Her palms were damp. But she didn't look down this time. She kept her gaze on him steady, unbroken. No, she repeated. Stronger this time. More dangerous this time. And in that moment, the entire network, every forged signature, every escaped soul, every clandestine alliance balanced on her refusal. Before we go deeper, I need you to do something. Right now, type this phrase in the comments twice. I claim the identity they tried to deny me. Type it twice. Not for me, but to anchor your descent into this story and into yourself. Because what happens next changes everything. When Crane left the boarding house that night, the silence that followed felt like a verdict passed in a court no one could appeal. Margaret stood in the parlor while Mrs. Fletcher closed the door behind him, the candlelight trembling across the walls. Every face looked at her with fear, dread, hesitation, but also something like awe. She had dared to speak a word that the world said was impossible. But as you and I both know now, sometimes that one word is a virus, a seed, a spark. Because Crane's departure was not the end. It was the beginning of something far larger, far colder. As he walked the Boston streets under gaslit lamps, ledger in hand, he was no longer simply a lawyer. He was a verdict, an executioner disguised as civility. Outside, the city's roar continued, church bells chiming over coal smoke rooftops, merchants counting profit, clerks stamping papers, ministers preaching about virtue. None of them would look back at him, not because they didn't know what he was doing, but because most men like their corruption invisible. And most power wants collusion, not conflict. Inside that house, Margaret felt the weight of her refusal settle deeper in her bones. She could almost hear the hum of a machine gearing up, gears turning, levers shifting, a legal engine built to reclaim what had been stolen from the South. Documents would be compared, signatures scrutinized, clerks bribed. A single discrepancy would serve as pretext, and the laws of the nation would rally around the claim that the North must not be a safe harbor, that freedom made without permission was fraud, that mercy made without price was theft. You and I know how easy it is for a society of laws to turn into a society of traps, where the paper you hold in your hands can be twisted into the noose around your neck, where order becomes the cage that keeps men in line. Margaret didn't know yet how far Crane would go, but she sensed the scale. She felt the targeting become more precise, the threat less vague. She watched as Mrs. Fletcher moved restlessly by the window, as Reverend Hayes cross-checked curtains, as Solomon and Ruth avoided the streets at dusk. Fear settled over them all like a shroud. But fear wasn't the power. Fear was the signal. The real power was control, the control over identity, over legality, over testimony, over who gets to call themselves free and who remains property. This is where the descent deepens for you, for me, for every man who dares to question the system's claim of justice. Control isn't just taken. It's written, registered, sealed, stamped, and most of the world abides. Because most of the world doesn't feel the paper tighten around its throat. Most of the world doesn't hear the crack of the ledger before the chains clink. But Margaret did. And in that room, alone with her forged identity and a single defiant no, she became more than a name on paper. She became a threat, a spark, a reckoning waiting to unfold. Hold that word in your mind, because what comes next will reveal the cost of holding a name the powerful refuse to honor. Deep beneath the shattered monastery lay the chamber no map had ever shown, a hollow carved before written time, the altar of whispers. And though the pilgrims above believed the ruin had been abandoned for centuries, someone had tended this place. Recently, torches flickered to life the moment Alina crossed the threshold, as if recognizing her, as if remembering her. She froze. Across the circular hall, carved into the stone with impossible precision, were mural after mural of the same woman. A chained figure, head bowed, back bent, always surrounded by faceless riders. But the seventh mural, the newest, was different. It showed her. Alina stumbled backward. The faces in the stone seemed to turn toward her, lips parting ever so slightly, as though ready to speak. Then she heard it. A whisper older than breath, softer than dust. Return what was taken. Alina's pulse hammered. Her lantern dimmed. its flame bending toward the altar at the center of the room, a slab of obsidian veined with scars of silver. And upon it lay a single object wrapped in decayed cloth. She hesitated. Every instinct screamed to flee, but the whispers kept building, weaving into her bones, pulling her forward. She unwrapped it, and everything in the world shifted. It was a mask human-sized, impossibly ancient, carved from bone that shimmered with a light it should not have possessed. And the instant it touched the open air, the ground trembled with a hunger the earth itself tried to conceal. Symbols flared around the chamber. The murals pulsed like beating hearts. And Alina understood with a clarity that cracked her to the core that this was no mere relic. It was the face of the forgotten ruler, the one whose name had been erased, the one who commanded the enslaved riders, the one whose return the warlords feared more than death. But the mask was incomplete. Something was missing, and the whispers told her exactly what. The bloodline. Bring the last of it. Alina staggered back as the truth flooded over her like floodwater in a crypt. The missing bloodline, it was her own. For centuries the truth had been buried beneath lies, beneath kingdoms, beneath rewritten history. But blood remembers. Blood keeps score. And Alina was not the observer of this legend. She was its conclusion. The walls shook, the murals cracked open, and something ancient began pushing from the stone. The faceless riders were waking. The murals split like cracked eggshells as the faceless riders stepped free from the stone towering silhouettes of armor and shadow. Each helm smooth, empty, hollow. They moved not with footsteps but with gravity itself, their presence bending the air. Alina stumbled back toward the altar, the mask glowing like a small moon in her trembling hands. The chamber had no doors now, only destiny. The riders circled her slow, deliberate, ritualistic as though reenacting a ceremony performed countless times before humanity walked upright. Choose. A gust of freezing air ripped through the chamber, extinguishing every torch. For a moment the world was nothing but darkness and the glow of the bone mask. Alina felt it pulling at her, calling to her bloodline, begging to sit upon a face that carried the very ancestry it once ruled. She raised the mask. And then, a memory not her own exploded in her mind. Civilizations bowing, armies kneeling, skies darkened by banners of an empire forgotten because it was erased, not lost. And at the center of it, the ruler wearing this very mask, a ruler with her eyes. Alina dropped to her knees, breathless, as she realized the truth. Her lineage wasn't cursed. It was hidden by those terrified of what the bloodline could become again. The riders leaned in, their headless visors reflecting her pale face. Choose. If she claimed the mask, she would inherit a throne carved from conquest and disappearance. If she rejected it, the riders would return to their stone prisons. But the truth of her blood, her past, her identity, would remain buried forever. The chamber rumbled. Dust fell like ash. Alina lifted her head. Her voice cracked but steady. I choose to know. Blinding white light erupted. The riders dropped to one knee. The walls rewove themselves from splinters of history. And from the darkness came the final whisper. Welcome home, Sovereign. If this story shook something ancient in you, drop a comment with the word Sovereign. I want to see how many of you felt the mask calling. Subscribe for more forbidden history tales. The next one goes even deeper. Share this video with someone who loves dark myths, or someone whose family has secrets they never talk about.